the heavy summer heat of Louisiana, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes the air feel hard to breathe, a small restoration crew arrived at an abandoned plantation near the Atchafalaya Basin. It had been empty for decades. No tourists, no visitors, no one willing to stay after sunset. The main house leaned slightly to one side, its white paint peeled away by time and storms. The windows were hollow and dark, like eye sockets watching the fields. Grass had swallowed the pathways. Vines crawled up the porch railings. And behind the house stood the slave cabins, or what was left of them. Just crooked wooden frames, sinking into the mud. Roofs collapsed. Doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. The place was too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of boots, crushing dry leaves and old wood. One of the workers stepped into a half-collapsed shack, shining his flashlight across the floor. That's when he noticed something under the broken boards. Not tools, not farming equipment, something smaller. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt. A shoe, tiny. Leather cracked with age, child-sized. Then another and another, buried together like they'd been tossed aside. The air suddenly felt colder. They kept digging, and that's when they hit bone. Small bones, fragile, the shape unmistakable. Ribs, a skull, little fingers, a child, maybe two, maybe more. But something wasn't right. These weren't the remains they expected to find in former slave quarters. Some strands of hair still clung to the soil, light brown, almost blonde. The skulls had narrow features, delicate structures, not matching the records of the enslaved families who were documented to live there. These children looked white, or close enough to pass. The workers stopped talking. No one wanted to say it out loud. Because if white passing babies were buried in slave cabins, it meant only one thing. They weren't accidents. They weren't strangers. They belonged to someone. And when historians later examined the site, they uncovered a truth far darker than the graves themselves. The plantation owners already knew those children existed, and they had gone to great lengths to make sure no one else ever would. To understand what they found buried behind those cabins, you first have to understand what a plantation really was. Because the word plantation sounds harmless, like farmland, like crops and sunlight. But Louisiana plantations weren't farms, they were prisons without walls, work camps disguised as homes, places people entered and almost never left. From sunrise to long after dark, the fields were alive with movement, the sound of metal tools striking soil, chains clinking, overseers shouting orders across the sugarcane rows. The air smelled of sweat, mud, and rot. Thousands of enslaved men, women, and children were packed into rough wooden cabins barely big enough to lie down in. No glass windows, no proper beds, just dirt floors and thin blankets that did nothing against the cold nights. In summer, the heat turned the cabins into ovens. In winter, they became ice boxes. Disease spread fast. Help came slow. Families weren't protected. They weren't even recognized. On paper, they weren't mothers or fathers or sons. They were numbers, property, livestock with names. Children weren't treated like children. They were counted the same way you counted cattle. Born into bondage the second they took their first breath. If a baby cried, it wasn't comfort that came first. It was calculation. How much would this one be worth? How many years until they could work? But there was something else happening on these plantations. Something no ledger ever recorded. Something spoken about only in whispers, at night. After the fields went quiet, footsteps creaked across the wooden porches. Doors opened slowly, then closed. Owners, overseers, drunk, untouchable, certain no one would ever stop them. They walked into those cabins like they owned the air itself, uninvited, unpunished. Women had no power to refuse, no law to protect them, no one coming to help. And months later, pregnancies appeared. Babies were born. Some looked like their exhausted mothers, dark hair, dark skin, familiar faces. But some didn't. Some had pale skin, straighter hair, light eyes that didn't match anyone else in the cabin. Children who looked like they belonged in the big house, not the slave quarters. And the moment those babies opened their eyes, they created a problem. A dangerous one. Because their very existence exposed a secret the plantation system could never allow anyone to see. Plantation owners didn't just control land, they controlled bloodlines. Because slavery in Louisiana wasn't random cruelty. It was organized, legal, calculated, built on one quiet rule that almost nobody questioned. A rule written into law like it was nothing. If your mother is enslaved, you are enslaved. It didn't matter who your father was, didn't matter what you looked like, didn't matter if your skin was pale enough to pass for white. The law followed the mother, always, which meant something terrifying. Even if the father was the master himself, the child still belonged to him as property, not as family. Property, especially if he was, because admitting the truth would mean something dangerous. It would mean these men weren't just plantation owners. They were fathers, and fathers have responsibilities, inheritance, recognition, a name. And if word got out that half the children in the cabins carried the master's blood, everything could collapse. Reputation destroyed. Wives asking questions, neighbors whispering, courts getting involved, power slipping. So they did what powerful men have always done when faced with inconvenient truth. They erased it, quietly, systematically, coldly. These children were hidden, moved to separate cabins away from others, listed under false names in ledgers, sometimes marked simply as extra, like spare tools, like broken equipment. If visitors came, those children disappeared first, locked away, sent into the fields, told not to speak, not to look up, not to be seen. Some were sold off to distant plantations without warning, gone overnight, families waking up to empty blankets, no explanation, no goodbye. And other times, they simply vanished. No sale records, no transport logs, nothing. Just gone. Historians later found old plantation journals filled with short, emotionless notes, cold handwriting, businesslike. One phrase repeated again and again. Problem handled. 2 words. That was it. No details, no names. Just a quiet confirmation that something had been taken care of. And today, most researchers agree on what those words really meant. It didn't mean relocation. It didn't mean adoption. It meant silence, permanent silence. Because some babies were never meant to grow up, and some secrets were never meant to breathe. When modern researchers finally returned to the plantation site, it wasn't curiosity that brought them there. It was suspicion. Old maps didn't match the land anymore. Cabins that should have held dozens of people had no burial records nearby, no cemetery, no headstones, nothing. And historically, that made no sense. Because even in the harshest conditions, people bury their dead. Someone always remembers, unless they weren't meant to be remembered at all. So the digging began, slowly, carefully, shovels slicing through layers of thick Louisiana mud, the air heavy with humidity, cicadas screaming in the trees, each scrape of metal against dirt echoing louder than it should. At first they found nothing, just roots, rocks, broken pottery. Then one volunteer's shovel hit something soft, not stone, not wood, something fragile. They knelt down and brushed the soil away with their hands. Cloth, rotten fabric, wrapped tight around something small, too small. When the shape became clear, nobody spoke. A bundle about the length of a forearm, inside each bones, tiny ribs, a skull no bigger than a fist, an infant, then another grave, and another, all behind the cabins. Not in rows, not organized, just shallow holes, hastily dug. Like someone had been in a hurry, no markers, no coffins, no names, just scraps of cloth and dirt. Some were newborns, some toddlers barely old enough to walk. It felt less like a cemetery and more like something someone had tried to hide. Weeks later, the lab results came back. And that's when the real shock hit. DNA testing revealed European ancestry in several of the remains. Not distant, not mixed generations ago, recent, direct, close family matches, connected to the plantation owner's bloodline, his relatives, his flesh and blood, his own children, buried behind slave cabins like trash, disposed of like waste, because their existence was inconvenient, because their faces told a truth the plantation system could never allow. Every bone became evidence, every grave became a confession, and suddenly the horror of slavery wasn't just chains or whips or fields. It was something quieter, something colder, more deliberate, the kind of cruelty that doesn't shout, the kind that calculates, that plans, that erases its own blood, just to protect a name. Today, if you visit that land, you wouldn't know anything ever happened there. The cabins are gone. No wooden walls, no doors, no smoke rising from cooking fires, just open space, wild grass swaying in the wind, tall trees leaning over the earth like silent witnesses. Nature has swallowed the plantation whole. Rain washed away the footprints. Storms tore down the roofs. Time erased the buildings, as if the land itself was trying to forget. But forgetting isn't the same as forgiving, because the ground still remembers. It always does. Every time archaeologists dig somewhere in the South, another story rises with the dirt. Another tiny skeleton, another unmarked grave, another child who never made it into the records. No birth certificate, no church entry, no name carved into stone. It's like they never existed at all, except they did. They laughed, they cried, they were held by their mothers. For a few short moments, they were alive. And then history decided they were inconvenient, disposable. Proof that slavery wasn't just forced labor. It wasn't just chains or cotton fields or auction blocks. It was something deeper, something more disturbing. Control over life itself, control over who gets to live, and who quietly disappears. Even if that life carried your own blood, even if that child had your eyes, and maybe the scariest part isn't what happened, it's how normal it was. These weren't hidden crimes committed in darkness. People knew, the owners knew, the overseers knew, the neighbors knew, the wives knew, everyone knew. But no one spoke. Because silence was easier, because power protects itself, because truth is dangerous, so they buried it. Literally, covered it with dirt, with grass, with time, hoping the earth would keep their secrets forever. But history has a strange habit. Secrets rot, wood decays, records fade, and eventually the ground gives them back, bone by bone, grave by grave, until the past finally whispers, what it was never allowed to say. In the suffocating heat of Louisiana, an abandoned plantation stood rotting in silence. No voices, no footsteps, just broken cabins slowly sinking into the mud. For decades, no one bothered to ask what happened there. Until one day, workers restoring the property found something beneath the floorboards of an old slave shack. Tiny shoes, fragments of cloth, and bones, small ones, children's bones. But these weren't the remains anyone expected. Some had light hair, pale skin, features that didn't match the enslaved families who once lived there. White passing babies, buried behind slave cabins like they were never meant to be found. As historians dug deeper, a darker truth began to surface. Plantations weren't just farms. They were prisons, places where people were treated like property and children like inventory. And at night, when no one was watching, owners crossed lines no law ever punished. Months later, babies were born, like some carrying the faces of the very men who claimed to own them, children who exposed a secret too dangerous to admit. So they were hidden, erased from records, sold away, or worse, buried in shallow, unmarked graves. DNA tests would later confirm the unthinkable. Many of those children carried the plantation owner's own blood, his sons, his daughters, disposed of simply because their existence threatened his power. Because sometimes, cruelty isn't loud, it's quiet, calculated, deliberate. Today, the buildings are gone, nature has reclaimed the land, but the soil still remembers. And every time the ground is disturbed, history rises with it, a reminder that some secrets aren't lost. They're buried, waiting to be uncovered.